And good afternoon. Where's my moderator? Where is that?
Dr. Kramer.
Is he? Is Dr. Kramer?
We were just with him. He's coming.
Okay. Wait a minute. We haven't got the. We're waiting on the moderator. I can introduce him when I see him. Oh, there he is. Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon and welcome to our cyber panel. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing this afternoon's moderator, Dr. Franklin Kramer, who is making his way up to the podium at this time. He is the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and the Board of Director of the Atlantic Council. And I want to thank you so much for being here, sir. Dr. Kramer has been a senior political appointee in 2 administrations, including Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs for President Clinton, Secretary Perry and Secretary Cohen, and previously as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for International Security Affairs. Among his current activities, Dr. Kramer is the principal editor and has written several chapters for the book Cyber Power and National Security, and is a principal editor and chapter author for the book Civil Power and Irregular Conflict, and is co-author and co-project director of Transportation Cooperation for Sustainable Energy Security. That looks like some great midnight reading there, and I'm looking forward to reading something like that. He has received his J.D. magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, don't hold that against him, and has a B.A. from Yale University. And Secretary Kramer, I'd like to thank you for being here, and I will also like to thank the panelists for being here, and I'll let you introduce them and have a great session.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it, and thanks very much for all of you who are here in the audience. The topic of cyber is as current and as difficult as I think anyone we're going to talk about, except maybe the budget conversation, which was the prior panel. We've got a great group here. I think many of you know them. And what we want to do is we want to lay out some of the questions for you that we think are critical to talk about, maybe give you some hypothetical answers, but also hear from you all as to what your concerns are, how you see the issues, and what you think the department and other parts of the government as well as the private sector need to do. If I can spend a minute just sort of laying some groundwork. The title was called Cyber, How Much Should Be Militarized? But I think the real question is, how should the military, the Department of Defense, work with other governmental elements, private sector, international partners to really make something stable and secure in the cyber realm, a realm that really is very recent in terms of the problems that we face. I don't know how many of you would remember the first time that you used Google, for example, as opposed to other search engines, or Facebook is less than 10 years old or the like. Big data, a set of words that's probably no more than 3 years old. So all this ferment is going on in cyber, and at the same time, we're all looking at the issue of cybersecurity, security of the networks, and how do we deal with that. And if you were to do a 2x2 matrix, and we're not allowed to use slides up here, so you'll have to do it in your head. And you put on one side pre-war and war on the top, and then you put the other side outside the U.S. and inside the U.S. Down the side. You'd say outside the U.S. war, that's where the department clearly is. And you would think, okay, that's the part that's militarized. But even thinking about that, you would say to yourself, as soon as you thought about it a little bit, oh, gee, it's not going to work for just the military to do that. By way of example, if we're forward, and we hope to stay forward, we're going to be in a host nation. And that host nation's critical infrastructure is going to be potentially at risk. A hypothetical conflict in the Gulf with a hypothetical country called Iran would potentially raise some issues as to whether or not they would use cyber against our forces on land and otherwise, and for that matter, our coalition partners. So right off the bat, you can't just think the Department of Defense. Cyber also can bring into this country capabilities against us that in other arenas are not so easy to bring to bear against the United States. So we've seen Secretary Panetta, when he's Secretary of Defense, talk a lot about the problem of critical infrastructure. We've seen the President, the DNI, and others talk a lot about the problem of cyber espionage. These are problems that are being faced by not only the government, certainly the government, but also by the private industry. The critical infrastructures, electric power grid, telecoms, financial, cyber espionage, the defense industrial base, and others, oil and gas industry, for example. So how do we deal with all that? What role does the DoD have, and what role do others have? Department of Homeland Security obviously has a critical role in this regard. And what do the companies themselves do, and who do they work with in order to deal with those kinds of issues? OT&E, organized, train, and equip. And you think about that, that's something that's pretty obvious, DoD does. But it's also pretty obvious once you realize that it goes beyond the department that we have to think OT&E for everyone else. How do we organize the government? Where do we find those really great cyber warriors who don't necessarily even want to be called warriors, but who are great people in cyber, help them support the companies, help them innovate, help them create defenses, help them work with the government? How do we integrate capabilities that are outside the traditional military, traditional lines of authority that we all know pretty well, in an arena where it's much more important to have those capabilities out in the nation itself, because you can't just defend everything utilizing a traditional military type approach. I already mentioned the espionage problem, and it's a problem more for companies even than it is for the government. But what about the response? Is there something called a right of self-defense in cyber? There's been a lot of talk about that, at least among the chattering classes in Washington. Should a company have the right of self-defense? And how far would that go? We have plenty of examples in regular law, if you will, stand your ground, type approaches. Someone enters your house, what can you do? But cyber's not quite the same, because if you go out and do something, you not only affect necessarily the bad guy, but you may affect many other people. How do we think about that? And should there be some kind of arrangement, some kind of governance arrangement that needs to be a combination of the companies or the entities and the government, or maybe nothing at all? Very, very much an open question. So with that, let me turn this over. We have four great speakers. We're going to start with Admiral Brown. He, as I think many of you know, is the former Deputy Commander of U.S. Space Command. He's a former President and CEO of FC International. And I'll let him sort of set the stage, and then we'll talk to the rest of our panelists, and we'll just go right through that session, and then we'll look forward to having each of you and get your thoughts. So, Admiral Brown.
Thanks, Secretary Kramer. It's been a great day. Admiral Gorton, he started off this morning, and he suggested that some other panel may be the most important, but I will assure you that there's not a more important topic than cyber for our nation today. I'd like to start with I want to make you understand two things. Number one, I'm not a lawyer. I don't like lawyers, but I'm going to talk about legalities here in a moment. And secondly, unlike the other panel members, I don't have a title. I don't have a position, and very frankly, I'm very happy to tell you I don't have a job. So when you really want to listen, these are the ones to listen to. Cyber, how much should be militarized? I think it's a marvelous subject, but I suggest that before we decide that, we needed to say cyber, how much can legally be militarized? Now, I break cyber up very simply. I'm a Texas Aggie, so I break it into six. That's unusual. We do have a second hand. Into six areas: governance, standards, cybersecurity, cyber crime, privacy and civil liberties. That's my fifth. And sixth, the free flow of information. So before we decide to militarize, we need to determine in which of these six areas does the military actually have the lead. Governance, no. I suggest that the Congress and the administration are going to continue to offer governance for cyber. Standards, no. Congress and the Department of Homeland Security. Cybercrime, no. The nation has said the FBI is in charge of cybercrime. Privacy and civil liberties, I'm going to say no. DHS, the Justice Department. So that leaves us the two remaining cyber issues as candidates for militarization: cybersecurity and the free flow of information. So let's begin with cybersecurity. Let me start by, let's just look at Title 10. Title 10 is just a little bit larger than the Bible, and I've reduced it again, Texas Aggie style, down to 3. Title 10 says the armed forces will provide for peace and security. They'll support national policies, and they'll win the nation's wars. It says some other things as well, but those are the main points. So clearly, to me, Title 10 puts the .mil domain clearly in DoD cyber job jar for militarization. But here's a but. Since the early 2000s, the Department of Homeland Security has been responsible for security of the .gov domain. Additionally, DHS has, and this is in their mission statement, 2 areas. 1, to facilitate cyber threat info sharing and partnering with the private sector to prevent critical infrastructure. Secondly, they are assigned the task to balance protecting critical infrastructure from cyber attack with balance that cyber protection with privacy and civil liberties. So I'm really, really tickled when I look at the panel composition that we have Admiral Parker here representing DHS. As a matter of fact, if you're going to listen very, very carefully, I would listen most carefully to his remarks. I mean, no offense to the Army or to Terry. So our nation's leadership has DoD clearly in a supporting role in national cyber defense with DHS as the lead agency. Washington recognizes that we need to maintain an environment that encourages public-private information sharing while protecting fundamental liberties and rights in cyberspace. So I suggest, and we in our discussion a few moments ago upstairs, Terry disagreed, and that's just fine, but I suggest that we need to avoid attempting to militarize the internet in the name of cybersecurity. Okay, and that 6th area of what's left of my 6 issues as after cybersecurity, the free flow of information. Well, I would suggest that we all agree that that's what this is all about. How do we ensure the free flow of information? And frankly, when I wrote that down, all I came up with a series of questions, and I answered them myself, and maybe you'll have different answers or other panel members will have different answers. But the questions I came up with is, will the private sector welcome additional government oversight, militarization, in the .com, .net, .edu? I suggest probably not, and I also suggest it's probably illegal. Secondly, would militarization increase public-private sharing? I suggest probably not. So third, would militarization increase the free flow of information? This last and 6th category, and frankly, I don't think that would happen either. So we have some real issues to think about when we talk about the militarization in the cyber domain. I think DoD is best suited at protecting its own networks, and that's a big job, and ensuring the free flow of information in the .mil domain, and supporting DHS efforts in protecting critical infrastructure, our nation's critical infrastructures. And I guess finally, I agree, and I'm serious when I say I think it would be a very big mistake for us to even attempt to militarize the internet. And I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you very much. And I think you hear just in that list of 6 points, and it's more than 6 really, how complicated this whole set of issues are. How do you do the protection part, the security part, security of the network, while ensuring a free flow of information, while ensuring civil liberties and privacy at the same time? And how do you actually, in real life, create those kind of partnerships between one government agency and another that really work, especially when you need to bring in the private sector. So with that, I'm going to turn that simple question over to Admiral Parker. Admiral Parker is the commander of the Atlantic Area Commander Defense Force East. I believe I heard it right when he told me he only has to work with 5 COCOMs, a simple little problem. And so if he can solve the 5 COCOM problem, I'm sure he can solve the cyber problem. So, sir, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I didn't catch the earlier parts of the day. I'm actually hosting a flag conference at my quarters right now, so I'll rush home after this to count the silverware when we're done. But this has been a thorny problem for us, and it's interesting. It's a real dichotomy for us because within the different domains inside DHS, things that fly tend to get a lot of attention because of the speed they run at. Things on rails have a higher speed, and the thing that's always slow and plodding and methodical and takes days and weeks and months is the maritime domain. And then you shift over to cyber, and we have the largest shift to get to. One of the reasons I'm here as a non-cyber person generally, not a CIO, don't have that background or training. I am a gadget guy, but that doesn't count, is because this is fundamentally an operational issue. And one of the governance issues that Admiral Brown talked to didn't address the fact that there's no central belly button that sort of pulls all that together. And generally speaking, organizations, private and public, tend to push this down to their CIO to fix the problem. And that really is handing over the problem of house security to your plumber, which may not be necessarily the way you want to go. So I'm honored to be here. One of the things we're trying to do as we look at this is, first of all, understand our position in this. And from a militarization standpoint, I think you have to look at, first of all, what the lane is of the military and where that goes. We've wrestled this problem in the history of our organization when post-World War I, after we had been part of the Navy in that particular conflict, a lot of our officers thought the best place to be would be back inside the Navy. And the way we solved that, our first commandant of the modern-day Coast Guard said, we have to remember what our primary purpose is, and that should decide how we train, organize, and equip. So I think you've got the calculus right so far in terms of not wanting to militarize it, but I think there's a lot of value to add there. I would also argue that one of the things that we do fairly well as an organization within DHS or government writ large is the interagency piece, and the fact that we touch a lot of the public sector, and whether it's in the energy sector or transportation sector, and sometimes even in others that are there. One of the things we do is we bring people together in a pre-need relationship, and we have standing committees like harbor safety committees and area maritime security committees that have gotten very practiced and very good over time based on legal regimes, but they tend to be more physical and kinetic in effect. So we're trying to get those bodies of people to understand the cyber effects on them, both individually. It's not like you draw a fence line around a facility and say that's good anymore. The threat comes through the phone line, comes through any data transmission, could be carried in a thumb drive. It's a very, very different environment that is geographically agnostic in terms of its vector. So we're getting a better understanding of that, and those committees, as they work through that, are understanding this interdependence they have that is really pretty interesting to watch in the maritime environment. And from a DoD perspective, I would argue that I don't think we really fundamentally understand, because when we put something in a pipe logistically to support the warfighter downrange, there's an assumption that that pipe will be there, whether it's barge traffic, aircraft, whatever, and there's a risk associated to the resilience of that system that has a cyber relation to it that would be one of the points I would focus some of the DoD efforts to make sure that that pipe is as reliable as the assumption would presume. So that's one of the places I'd look to go. In terms of DHS responsibilities, we're clearly trying to work within the department. TSA has the other two domains that are intersected with cyber. From a maritime side, again, there are not a lot of places to grab hold of things to action them as you try to pull these together. So the first place you got to go is get to understand risk, and then get a common definition in terms of the standards that Admiral Brown was talking about as we focus on how we get that done. .gov, critical infrastructure. The critical infrastructure that's most important is the one that you personally care about, so getting that sweat across the government has been a very interesting exercise. When we started the critical infrastructure list post 9/11, even just on the maritime side, the state of California had more critical infrastructure listed than the entire country listed. when I was working that list. And within the state of California, actually the city of San Francisco listed more things than the state had in terms of numbers. So getting that common understanding of what the resilience is for the nation is, and then what the role of the federal government is, and then within the federal government enclave, what the role of DOD will be and where they can be helpful, I think it would be great. The last observation I'll offer you is from somebody who's had a lot of time in and around DOD. I was actually a J3 at U.S. Southern Command, spent a lot of time talking cyber issues in that particular vector. When I went up to NSA for my very first brief as a 2-star up there in that domain, I came away with the understanding that DOD would be the last cyber cockroach standing in cyber Armageddon, and I thought that maybe wouldn't be helpful to some of our other more vulnerable sectors like, I don't know, financial sector or maybe the power grid. So there are places that we would want to watch. So as we protect our own systems, we have to understand, just like force protection of our forces, when we deploy folks forward, I will put my folks at risk in order to make mission, just like we should put our own stuff at some level of risk, and maybe my esteemed colleague to my left won't agree with this, but in order to make sure that we do the things that we're chartered to do by our government at the end of the day. So being completely secure inside of our own networks would be another place I would look to see where the unintended consequences are, where it makes other targets look much more inviting to those who would do us harm. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next up is Terry Halverson. He's the Chief Information Officer, Department of the Navy. And for those of you who were at the last panel, you might have heard, the only place that's going to get extra money is cyber. But even cyber is going to have a lot of trade-offs to be undertaken. So one of the questions will be, operating networks, business networks, how do you actually place the money? He's the guy who's got to figure this all out. Where does he take the risk? Where does he put his resources? How to do it? And then it's how does he actually connect up and figure out how does he relate to the private sector? How does he relate to the DIB and the like? So with that, Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and all my esteemed colleagues and the audience. Thank you for being here today. I think this is a fun topic. I don't know that I so much disagree with the colleagues on either side of me, but I might take a little bit different tack or position. First of all, the question about cyber being militarized has already been answered. It is militarized. There are people doing bad things, both criminals and nation states, in the cyber world. So to some extent, it has already been militarized. We use it like we use any other warfare domain area to conduct operations, and that's already happening. We are going to have to operate as DOD in the .com, if you'll let me use that word, as the general internet. And there's no way to secure all of the stuff we do in the .com or even the .mil world at the unclassified level completely. It is, as my Coast Guard colleague says, it is going to be a risk calculus. I mean, we in DOD get paid, and Coast Guard gets paid the same thing, to take risks. We have to also get paid to is where you take the smart risks. So we're going to have to figure that out in what we do invest in, and how do you pay that bill. And one of the things that we're going to have to play a role in, and I don't know exactly what role it's going to be yet, I don't know that anybody does, is answering part of the economic questions. If you're an industry and you are being told, you have to now spend money to protect something that you might say, well, wait a minute, isn't that what I have a standing Department of Defense to do, to protect that industry? You might be asking yourself, why do you have to spend the money? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask in our form of government and in our democracy. So we're going to have to answer those questions about who pays the bill for cybersecurity, how that bill gets secured, when is it the right time to pay the bill, and when do you live with the risk. One of the things that's hard about the cyber domain is, so when have you done something in the cyber domain that it's been a big topic? The red line is a big topic in the news today. What is the red line for cyber? When have I done enough cyber that now the Department of Defense gets involved doing the things that we do best, which is, retaliate and destroy things? When does that happen? great question, and I don't purport to know the answer to that, but that is part of the national debate that we're going to have to go through as we answer this question. And there's some interesting things, people say, well, the Defense Department doesn't have a role in that. I think during the Second World War, both the Coast Guard and the Navy escorted ships, civilian ships, put them up in convoys. And the reason we did that is because it wasn't just all about military supplies. It was supplies to get across. There was commerce involved. There was economics involved in doing that, and it had to win the war. If today you would grant me that data, information, is as valuable to the economies, to war fighting, everything else, do we have a role in escorting the data? I don't know the answer to that, but it's an interesting question to see what role we would have to play in escorting the data in general. And the last thing I'll leave you with is we'll be signing up volunteers to be cyber wardens at the end of this meeting, where you will go around and monitor your neighbors for their cyber conduct on the internet to see that they're maintaining status quo and doing the right things. I mean, bit of a joke there, but I mean that's kind of some of the things that you really have to work your way through. To Brown's point, where is legal, where isn't it illegal, and where are we willing to redraw boundaries in what is really a new combat area? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry. The obvious point about cyber is it doesn't end at the water's edge, so to speak. It's inherently international. If you send an email, it's not necessarily, from someone in the audience to me, it's not necessarily going to go just via U.S. carrier, U.S. ISP. It may bounce out and back because that's the way the system works. So the international aspects of cyber are critical. And one of the players in this, of course, is the military at the international level. And the organization that has a key role in that is ACT, Allied Command Transformation. Major General Bayer here is the Deputy Chief of Staff, Strategic Plans and Policy at ACT. And we've asked him to take a look at this, if you will, from the coalition point of view, from the international point of view, and give us a perspective so we stop just thinking about it's Washington to New York to San Francisco, and then we remember it's the whole world. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I am honored to be here. Right up front, I would tell you I'm a U.S. Army cavalryman turned strategist who knows very little about cyber, but I can give you a perspective from NATO's standpoint on where we are. And I think a look at where NATO is a great contrast to the challenges that our nation internally is facing. Imagine the challenge now of taking 28 nations with all of their individual elements of national power and trying to get them all to understand, visualize, decide, and direct outcomes in the cyber environment. Pretty challenging. So NATO first in 2002 is when we first had a public proclamation that we needed to get serious about cyber as part of the Prague Summit. And in that year, we directed that we would stand up the NATO Computer Incident Response Capability, totally focused on securing our own networks. In 2013, we will achieve full operational capability of something we directed 11 years ago. That gives you a good perspective of how long it takes 28 to come to a meeting of the minds and execution. Our strategic concept of 2010, it for the first time included an allowance for cyber in the domain, the security domain, and talked about our requirement to take defensive measures. And our focus in the alliance right now is prevention, defense, resilience. There is absolutely no discussion, given the political sensitivity and the wide divergence of views of anything offensive when it comes to cyber. And it is not, there has been some intellectual discussion about NATO as a political military alliance that has, via the Washington Treaty, this collective defense arrangement via Article 5, where we pledge to defend each other. And there's been intellectual discussion about when does cyber cross that threshold, but it's been nothing but intellectual. And if you understand what happened to Estonia in 2007, there's a potential precedent inside of the alliance for a nation to come to the alliance and say, hey, listen, this set of actions triggers certainly Article 4 consultation and potentially Article 5. We had our first cyber policy in 2008. Unlike the U.S., we have not in NATO classified cyber as a specific standalone domain. So we see it sort of as a horizontal enabler, but not a standalone domain. And we have established a center of excellence in Estonia. And if you follow cyber, you'll know that the Talon papers were produced here recently. A bunch of legal scholars through that COE posited on cyber future and the legal challenges. Pretty interesting reading. Now, having said all this, I'll just kind of walk you through what our sets of challenges are, and I think they're very, very familiar to you from a U.S. perspective. Well, first of all, not all nations are at the same level of capability. There is wide divergence with how nations have invested in capability in the cyber domain, both from a military and other elements of power. For some nations, it's fairly new, and the uncertainty of it makes it even more challenging. Information and intelligence sharing. In an alliance that has said we pledge ourselves via Article 5 to come to each other's common defense, we are very reluctant pre-conflict to share information and intelligence. You can imagine what that does in the cyber domain if you want to look at it from a coalition perspective. Infrastructure, the same piece with respect to information sharing. Interoperability, one of the strengths of NATO is we have a very detailed codification of common standards for the alliance. But the pace at which the cyber domain and data grows, and go back to my comment about the wide variance of capability, what we find literally is some of our coalition members are operating with technology in their public domain, at least, that is pretty old. So you have a real challenge with interoperability across the alliance. Probably the biggest thing is we're challenged in the alliance. You know, we recognize that cyber defense requires some kind of in-depth capability, and it's not military-centric, and that it requires a comprehensive approach or a whole-of-government approach. But at the strategic level, in a political military alliance, we have yet to be able to come up with a definition of the comprehensive approach that all 28 can live with. Part of this is driven by the NATO-EU relationship, which is pretty complicated, but it drives part of this comprehensive approach piece. Effective partnering with industry. You know, our estimate in ACT and those who do cyber in the alliance is 85% of the critical infrastructure inside of the alliance is privately held. So it's much as you would see inside of the U.S. So imagine this problem of trying to effectively partner both across industry and the elements of 28 governments to get our arms around critical infrastructure. Then the idea of geography. You know, this transatlantic alliance, which quite honestly sometimes sees itself only as a transatlantic alliance, but cyber is a global threat. So sometimes we are challenged by our view of geography when we start to think about the cyber threat. And then, you know, not the least of our problems is fiscal austerity. So you have 28 nations right now, regardless of what we consider to be the emerging threat of cyber, 28 nations that all are investing less in security each and every day. And then, as you've heard here, governance. We recognize that inside the alliance, governance of cyber is extremely complicated. We've made kind of a down payment on it by creating a cyber defense management board inside of NATO headquarters, but that is merely a staff tool. It is not truly a governance effort. So I'm ready for questions, should there be any. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to be happy to get questions. I think the way we're going to do it is ask people to go to the mics, identify themselves and the like. And just to start out, I want to ask one question first to the panel. Maybe I'll throw it to Mr. Halverson. Terry, you're working, of course, on what the Navy, and then in that context with the DoD CIO, what standards the department needs to meet. But the question I have is, does the department need to have its supporting activities, those groups, private companies and like, out in the private sector, do they need to meet certain standards in order to ensure that we can have the operational capabilities that we need in the event that we needed them?
I think the short answer to that is yes. I mean, as we particularly rely on what I'll call the classic industrial base. one of the things you always get these questions, what keeps you up at night? Well, one of the things that keeps me up at night is all of the data that's sitting out there in the contractor companies that build much of our warfighting capability. So I think certainly those companies that are part of the industrial complex, yeah, they're going to have to play by some set of standards if we're going to ensure that that data is protected. In the broader sense, I might ask the question a little bit of, are we in DoD going to have to look at partnering as we do our general business activity to set a common risk level of standards that we participate in at the same level industry does? And I think that's got to happen. A little bit to my Coast Guard colleagues, but we've got to be out there to know what the risk is. We've also got to share the risk. And frankly, from an economic standpoint, I have to pick some place that I'm going to take more risk. In the case of the Don, it's going to be around business operations more than it's going to be around, our military operations.
Do you want to jump in from the DHS point of view?
Well, I think I'll stick with the risk theme, and the risk for us really relates to resilience. So we have to elevate ourselves up to what are really the critical things. There's a lot of things you can sacrifice along the way, but the individual things that are there don't like to be sacrificed, and that's where the rub comes. In terms of who pays for that, right now the way we do that from a physical security standpoint is we create a physical risk paradigm with a legal regime that supports it. Wouldn't be hard to put that over as an overlay, as a standard towards cyber if we could get to a common definition of what risk and resilience issues were. So that really for us becomes the key question, to use a sort of a standing body and structure, if you will, to get to the heart of the problem.
Let me go to the audience then, and if you just identify yourself and then your question and comment.
Is this on? Okay. Terry Casto, AFCEA, proud to have served with Admiral Brown on the as an RVP, and thanks to the Texas Aggie for summarizing the problem. I got to tell you, this is a frustrating panel, not because you guys haven't done a really great job of hitting on the various elements and the points that you made, but there are so many threads here that it would take, it would take me 3 hours just to ask all my questions, let alone trying to get a discussion.
Panel goes to 9 o'clock.
What's that?
I was just joking. I said the panel goes to 9 o'clock.
I'm here for you. Hey.
9 to midnight.
Yeah. So many thoughts, right? You talk about risk. I feel like a worker in a shirt factory in Bangladesh, right? It didn't fall down today, but that doesn't mean it's not going to fall down tomorrow. So when we talk about the risk posture, I submit that we're already taking incredible risks, more risks than we should be taking, and we're paying a significant price. It's in the news all the time about the loss of IP and what that's doing to the economic posture for this country versus our global competitors. I think on the issue of one of your 6 points, sir, of privacy and anonymity, I think that is something that we need a cultural shift that says, look, we have to give that up in order to get the cybersecurity that we need, given the dependence that we have on the networks that we rely on. But what I want to 16 other questions notwithstanding, I want to refer you to the May 10th article in Reuters that got to the heart of a particular issue, and that is the inherent conflict between attack, defend, and exploit that exists when you talk about cyber. And so what I heard today was a discussion, rightfully so, from DHS and others about the defense side of it. But the issue is balance, right? And there is an assertion worth discussing that we have the balance imbalanced in terms of wanting to preserve our ability to attack and exploit, and the price we're paying for that is a weakened ability to defend. I wonder if any of you would care to comment on that.
We'll get the panel. Give them a second. Let me just make a couple of points in your earlier points. With respect to cyber, it is early days in the sense that we haven't had such dependency on this for a long time. We've always had C4I, et cetera, but the greatest dependency is in the last 10 years. So I've often said that where we are now in cyber is not too different than where we were, say, in the early 70s in the environmental arena. We knew there was a big problem. The birds were falling out of the sky. DDT was, killing the eggs, et cetera, et cetera. Rachel Carson had written a book, and we had just started doing the laws, and it took about 15 years to put those laws in place, put the structure in place, get the private industry to agree to comply with it. And they found, after great resistance, in general, they found it was better for them from a private industry point of view. Now, I don't want to say everything's going to work out perfectly for cyber. All I want to point out is it's not hopeless. We are moving forward. And as Pete said, even NATO can move forward, although a little more slowly than we would like. The second point I would make is that on the privacy side, one of the things to remember, I think, is that the bad guys are exploiting the absence of defenses. So the privacy argument actually cuts both ways. The argument one hears often from a, if you will, civil libertarian point of view is you want to be careful about how much the government gets into your knickers. And the recent articles on the Associated Press and whatnot raise that point. But in the meantime, somebody else is getting into your data all the time. So we just need to sort that conversation out. I don't mean to say I have the answer. I think sorting out's quite complicated. On your attack, defend, and exploit, I'm happy to turn that over to the panel. Would you like to try that, Evan Brown?
If I may, Terry, I think that, of course, the real problem is trying to localize and build tools that will then be reversible when you start talking about attack or active defense, whatever you want to call it. I mean, the nation has clearly said we're going to develop tools to defend the network, and I think I've never seen any defense policy that did not have as its foundation an attack capability. So you can read into that we're in fact spending time and effort in that area. My big concern is we may be spending too much time in the attack area because it's cool and it's fun and defense is kind of boring. I like to think that our nation is going to, both in DOD and .gov and in the private sector, are going to spend their time and efforts in defending the network and minimize or not overemphasize the attack and exploitation area.
The balance between defend, attack, and exploit is one that every warfighter deals with. I would argue that there's another layer to that, especially when you bring in private sector. They're going to look at the number of stakeholders they have and whether they're publicly held entity or not. They have different folks they're going to answer to for a variety of different reasons. And their risk calculus is fundamentally different than that of government, as you know. So when they do that, one of the things we look at when we deal with industry is how intrusive is our federal or governmental regime as we try to defend something, and does that in fact actually make it less robust so that it would limit its ability to grow and produce things that create the way of life that we seek to defend. I think in cyber that's a very elusive piece. First of all, because it's not well understood, certainly not down at the port level for all the different agencies and partners and stakeholders that are there. Those that are in regulated facilities have a better sense of that, I think, just as a result of the conversations that we're starting to have or have had over the last several years. But the attack piece in cyber is particularly hard, and especially when you draw in a number of different agencies. We don't understand, I don't think, really well in the federal side what happens when you take a certain action. There are very few people in government who do, so we've elevated that to a place where we hope that's right. To add all the different private enclaves and public open space to that, I think becomes increasingly problematic. You just don't know what happens on the downstream effects and whether it's a diversion that causes you in your defensive posture in making an attack to take out some friendly forces as well. So I think it's a good question to ponder, and I'm not going to touch a civil libertarian piece because I mean I'm all over trying to defend our rights. So I'll just stake my claim there. But I think when you look at it, though, the balance has to be broader than just whatever the warfighting skills are. You have to bring all the other elements to bear in that in terms of the final risk equation and the national resilience. I keep going back to that because I keep getting stuck there, and that's where I wind up at the end of every trail.
Yes, sir.
Admiral Parker, I'm going to pick up where you left off with the resilience, because after a disaster, any business that's left standing will be the one selling goods. So DHS, every business must have a plan, is the way to start off. Cyber really is no different than a kinetic war, because if damage is done to the United States, that is an attack. And if the military is behind their iron forts, I as a civilian, I as a company become the easy target. Take down the 911, stop the shipments to the grocery store so there is no food, and throw the country into chaos so that those who are trying to defend it are under duress, worrying about what's going on at home. Cyber is a bit different than regular kinetic kill weapons, because I can walk onto a naval base and touch a Tomahawk missile, but I can't leave with one. But if I come in and learn how to do cyber warfare, I can then take that home and with my computer do a DDoS attack. However, my question is about after we are attacked. How will the military has taken over the railway system during World War II. The military has taken over several private companies. After we're attacked with a cyber attack, any thoughts on how the military would take over the internet and how the cyberspace?
I'll leave you for the first shot. You can pick which company you want to run. I think the short answer is that the president has been pretty clear that the government and the military in particular are going to stay out of the private sector as much as possible. It's been most focused on the issue of whether or not there'd be government view into the content, for example, of cyber communications. I don't think we've had any actual specific conversation with respect to what happens after the fight, so to speak. The other thing I think is probably the case is that it's probably not too likely that we're going to have a cyber bolt from the blue attack, just cyber, by a nation state. I mean, you can't rule that out, but the more probable situation with the nation state is if you got into it, it's going to be a combination of kinetic and cyber, not just cyber. The bolt from the blue type attack probably would come about because of a terrorist type organization, if you will, a 911 rather than a Pearl Harbor. And in that situation, at least what the DNI has said in the most recent unclassified version is that whereas nation states, and they specifically list China and Russia, have significant cyber capabilities, so far less so with respect to the terrorist side, although there is the significant problem of rent a criminal, because there are some pretty good criminals out there who would have capabilities, but you need more than that. You need a real good view of what's going on, a lot of intelligence, a lot of prep the battlefield before you can do that. So I don't mean to turn away from your question, but I think there's some open issues. But let me turn it down and see where DHS is on this question.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily want to speak for DHS on this one, but I'll speak for myself in terms of which company I'd like to run. And probably I'd want one that would, provide me with all the gadgets that I could, stand at the end of the day and a good discount there. And we'll let your imagination run wild on that. I think from what's the role of the government and where's the military in that? I got to give you a little bit of history. Just in the last, 4 years, I left as the J3 at U.S. Southern Command after running the Haiti earthquake response for the DoD side in support of USAID and the State Department. As I was wrapping that up and driving up I-95 in my Mini Cooper to report to this job, the Macondo well blew out, and then I got to support that operation from the Coast Guard side of the house. Had a couple of weather events called hurricanes that have been pretty substantial in our world as well. Each one of those has an element to it that's very, very familiar to me at this point, and that is that whoever is responsible for it in crisis is overwhelmed. And whether that's the state, local government, whether it's any entity in federal government, whether it's an individual company, you need capability. And there's a lot of things that we can do, for instance, in the Coast Guard. We were the first responders in Haiti just because we were there. So whoever's there first has to be the first responder in whatever the thing is, and whether that's to restore data transfer, communications flow, power, getting facilities turned back on, whatever the thing is that causes a disruption. I'm agnostic of where I get that help. And what I really liked about turning to DOD and was proud of the efforts that we brought to bear in DOD during the Haiti earthquake was what DOD does really well is massive movements of lots of stuff over great distances in terms of logistics post-crisis. That doesn't really necessarily apply in the cyber world, but DOD has some capabilities that aren't particularly well known across parts of government that do crisis response that I think would be helpful to us over time to explore how you get some of those other things back up, whether it's data centers or telecom or whatever the thing is that's disrupted. So if they're not the right people to do that, I would argue that there are others out there who would do that for us. The other thing I found in all of these events was there were always public and private organizations that would come forward and want to be helpful. So you have to have a screening process for that to understand who that is and who you're letting in the door, because in your moment of need and crisis, your desire to get things running again can expose you vastly, exponentially greater than what you started with if that was just the entering volley and you didn't recognize it as such in the cyber world. So getting a better handle on what that is and understanding that is part of that calculus. But I don't know that I would turn away help from anywhere that wasn't already vetted. One of the things DOD brings to us is a fairly strongly vetted community that could be helpful, that has skills that could be applied there, whether or not they have the authorities to do that. In emergency, we found ways to get past that. No, I'm agnostic on source. And again, if a DOD cyber warrior of any flavor or any cyber person could bring me that capability and need when I was a person at the point of that, I would absolutely look to take advantage of that.
The encouraging thing is nobody is sitting on their hands. I mean, I met today, I've lived in Virginia Beach a long time, but I just met today a city official who is putting together a cyber team for local security. They say, hey, we provide security with our police department, our fire department. We finally realized that here locally we need to get business together. We need to put together a red team. We're going to do things on the local area. There's some very, very positive things happening across this great nation, not only at the big government area, but where real people are and have real issues, and they recognize that they need to do something and do it now. And frankly, it makes a great deal of sense. We need to identify where those organizations are. DHS needs to know where they are. They need to network them where they can so we don't keep relearning the same lessons across the nation in every city. But a lot of positive things are happening. Now, if I could just, while I've got the mic on, the book is Threat Vector that Admiral Gortney talked about this morning, and I have met Tom Clancy, but I don't get any. But it's a good book to read, and if you're concerned about what can in fact possibly happen, and it identifies China as the adversary, and it suggests there may be 10 million hackers there. I don't know if any of it is fact. I have no idea if there's a fact in the book, but it's a read that will you'll read it very quickly. You won't want to put it down.
Just on the private sector taking steps on its own, for example, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber, Bob Butler, is now down in Texas, and he's running an operation that the governor down there encouraged. I can't remember the exact name of it, but basically they're bringing a whole bunch of the large private firms in Texas together, a lot of the oil and gas firms, and they're creating an information sharing environment where they really are able to share information on cyber threats together. There's a similar organization up in New England run out of, it's out of Massachusetts. I believe the MITRE Corporation is involved with it, but I don't believe they're necessarily the heart of it, but they're involved. And so you see a number of these things growing up together, where a lot of the private sector is starting to take significant responsibility. It differs in different industries. And the real question, I think, is, okay, how do we build on that? Because the government can't do everything. And what part does the government have to do? And then what part can the private sector do? And then how do you incentivize? How do you incentivize the private sector to do what we all think it ought to do, especially when there are what you might call external diseconomies, things that are important beyond just the company's own circumstances. Can we create tax incentives? Can we do other kinds of things? Do we need regulation? So those questions are all up in the air. Yes, sir?
I'm Dick Mackey, former naval aviator, and Herb Brown knows that. I'd really like to follow up with Admiral Parker on the HADR and the forward presence we have that makes all that possible globally, but that's not the subject of the panel. We have in the air, sea, and land warfare domains the intelligence, the situational awareness, and the rules of engagement that will allow us to not absorb the first hit. I've seen that in too many exercises and a lot of other things, and it's a truism. In cyber, we have, I think, the intelligence. I think we have the situational awareness. We do not have the ROE that will allow us to not absorb the first hit. We don't have, to the best of my knowledge, the ROE that will allow us to go take out those servers through a cyber attack that will allow them to do their damage that they're going to create to us. Maybe more of a statement than a question, but it's an area that I think bears a lot of attention.
When you get into the actual ROE, of course, you've just walked out of this room and into a skiff. But I think you can say that there have been newspaper articles. I think General Alexander said publicly that they're seeking to develop the ROE. That's for his organization, and that he's got three types of teams that he's created. He's got one team that's focused on defense of the networks. He's got another team that's focused on offense, and he's got a third team that, broadly speaking, I think he calls a national event team, which basically is to help protect, if you will, industry and the American nation at large. So for each of those, he's obviously got to be thinking about ROE. Again, I said earlier it's early days, and I don't mean that people therefore ought to go slow. But I do think we need to recognize that Cyber Command didn't exist a few years ago. We're now got it up to a four-star general. It's probably going to turn out to be its own unified command, although I can't, I'm not the president, so I can't guarantee anything. But we are taking steps. But I'd be interested to get any thoughts, either from the NATO side or otherwise, on views about ROE, even on the defensive side. How do you deal with that? And when I say ROE, writ broadly, how do you deal with the problem? Or from what you see at DHS, or for that matter, with respect to the Navy, how you're organizing yourself to ensure that you're not going to be put down, so to speak, by the first hit.
I think, as you said, we have to be careful answering the question, but I think part of the problem in cyber, we tend to focus on what I'll call the big bang cyber event that is pretty clear and we'd have a pretty good response to, I think. The more typical action in cyber is a little more subtle. So part of the problem with ROE is where did it occur, and who occurred it? They're all questions in cyber that are a little harder many times to answer than, say, in a kinetic or other environment. So I do think we've got to spend some more time on that in-between area of cyber, because I think it's the most likely place we're going to have problems. The big bang cyber event coupled with something kinetic, I think we're pretty good on how we would respond to that, and I think there's some pretty good rules. Those more subtle attacks that might not be attacks and don't occur on DOD, but as the Coast Guard put it, occur in the private sector that we care about. That's a much more complicated set of rules than when you're just in our traditional air, sea, land combat areas.
I was waiting to see if Pete wanted to take that on with all 28, but if I could, just a couple of things. First of all, sir, thank you for your service. Sorry I was inartful in my HAADR analogy, but it was talking about really how DOD supports a larger effort writ large, and then really what they bring to the fight in that particular case. In terms of the ROE, I think we always, as a law enforcement guy as well, we think about extended self-defense arguments, and whether it's the use of force in law enforcement circles or the rules of engagement if we're acting under Title X authorities, we're just wired that way to protect things that we see that are going to do harm to others at a certain level, and there's thresholds associated with that. Those aren't clear at all in the cyber world, as you know and as you point out. In terms of how you get there, the small events would be a fun place to trigger that, because you could reach all the way into a hospital emergency room or critical care unit to where some individual hacker, and it doesn't even have to be somebody with malicious intent, could accidentally trigger, turning off life support systems. Is that a criminal issue? Is that a defense issue? If somebody in the DOD circle sees that, do they have the extended argument for self-defense or the defense of others to disrupt that if they have the capability? And is there culpability on that person's part if they don't take action and they have that available to them? These are really hard questions that General Alexander and his team have been wrestling with. A whole team of lawyers, both yes and no, in order to get to that. That domain is really ripe for picking there, I think, in order to get to the bottom of that. And it hits the fundamental question about who then will action that, and what are the obligations of those who have visibility and capability in order to do that. So I'm intellectually interested in joining that. I'm not sure I'm capable of answering that question.
May I? Admiral Mackey, I suggest that ROE is very, very important in peacetime, and I would say it's probably priority number one. I think once the shooting starts, and I think we're going to be surprised, it's going to go to priority number 4. Warriors think about, I want to stay alive, I want to keep my buddy alive, I want to accomplish the mission, and then ROE. They do it in that order. Unfortunately, Washington has those things reversed, but I think the forward deployed forces are going to know when to pull the trigger, and they're going to do it and do it well.
Yeah, all I would offer, I really can't begin to look at the complexity of 28 nations trying to do this, but I think we need to go back to our fundamental strengths. With the advent of new technologies throughout the history of mankind and as security forces, we've always figured this out. So sometimes going back to the basics and the fundamentals of remembering that, okay, so what is the right to defend yourself? Just apply it in a different way. And sometimes you got to do a little reverse engineering. And what I'm concerned about is sometimes the things that we don't understand, we fail to apply fundamental logical thinking to solve the problem.
Just to add one more thought, and as was indicated, the cyber problem is not necessarily the Big Bang. The ongoing problem is the espionage problem. So what's the ROE for espionage? Well, one of the things, of course, is diplomacy, and you've seen in the newspapers that we're now raising the issue with the Chinese at the highest levels. We'll see where that goes. At the other end, of course, there's a potential military response, but that's not normally a response with respect to espionage. There's law enforcement, and that's good, but it's slow because we have our own due processes. One of the things that I've advocated, and I just throw it out for the audience to think about, is whether we should give the president or his delegate, but give the president the authority to put what I call cyber sanctions on an entity or a country or anything in between. We have that in the non-proliferation area. We have it in the counterterrorism area, and we've used it, and we've even used it against countries that we have substantial trading relationships, like China, in the non-proliferation area. So it might be one more thing that you could do if the president could say, for example, there's a company called Mandiant. I think you probably all know about that. They issued a report a couple of weeks ago identifying a certain group in China as a source of cyber espionage. Should we put those people associated with that under cyber sanction? Second thing you might do is you might give companies the authority not just to get back their monetary amounts if we could figure it out, but maybe, something punitive like an antitrust, treble damages, or the like. So I think we need to sort of expand out our conversation about ROE from the purely military and put that into the economic and the legal and see whether or not we can do a little bit more than we've done before. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My question is also in relation to the fact that the cyber threat that we face today is much more multifaceted than the Soviet nuclear threat that we faced in the Cold War. Have our allies, who have many times already had a threat that has had the capability to cross their border in force, influenced the expediency with which we create our cyber defenses today? And are we really taking advantage of their experiences in that relation? And General Bayer, I'd appreciate it if you could take that question. Thank you.
I would go back to inside the alliance that's 28, varying levels of that understanding. So make no mistake, the Estonians absolutely understand the potential of offensive cyber action. But if it hasn't happened to you, it doesn't necessarily mean you understand it. And then relative to all the capability pieces. So it's a mixed bag. Inside the alliance, very much unsettled. So we've chosen, as I told you, to focus on the things that we can agree on. Okay, so how do you protect your own networks? And we're probably behind with respect to that, and relying significantly on the larger nations with more advanced capabilities to help us. So the short answer is no, we don't have common understanding, so we can't visualize a common outcome.
We do some things with allies and have taken advantage of some. So one really good example is Australia. They work very, very hard on cyber defense, and their Ministry of Defense has a separate section. I can't remember what it's called. It's DSD, but I can't remember what DSD stands for. And they did a very comprehensive analysis on what works. And they came up with about 35 things. And then they did a further analysis, and they said if you did these top 4, and they picked out 4 things, and they were patching within 48 hours, both operating and application systems. They were so-called least privileged, not allowing everybody on the network, on the wide area network or local area network to escalate the privileges, and what's called whitelisting, only run a certain number of programs that you designate. But if you did those 4, they said at least 85% of the attacks that are undertaken these days could be stopped. Now, we have had those conversations with the Australians and drawn on their capabilities. Obviously, the NSA has done its own analysis, but they work very, very tightly. And that's one of the positive things. There are other individual countries and some groupings that we work in, and then the U.S. does a very broad international strategy, and there is a cyber strategy. The President's put out a cyber strategy that talks about this. So at some levels, it's mostly conversation. There's a conversation with the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, ASEAN. That's mostly talk. There's conversations with other countries that are much more operational. And I think, again, I'd make the point that this is early days and we're really working our way forward. The European Union, which General Bayer talked about, does have a cyber grouping, has issued standards, but it hasn't really made them required for anyone yet. They're working their way forward, but they've done actually some more things recently. They've developed some groups that do things. So this is an international problem. You can't get from here to there being a good place without having a lot of international partners. And I think this is an area in which we haven't necessarily figured out the right forum. I mean, NATO's a great forum, but it's military, and I think the thrust of the conversation here has been military is not enough. You can't militarize everything. You're not going to get there. European Union's a great forum, but so happens the United States is not part of it. And furthermore, the European Union is having its difficulties, as many of you may have noticed, both with the euro and otherwise. So it's not the most dynamic organization at the minute. If you go into the Asia Pacific, which is a critical area of the world, we have some people there who are close allies, Japan, I mentioned Australia, Korea, and the like. We have some people who maybe, let's call them competitors in some ways. And the National Counterintelligence Executives publicly identified the Chinese as a problem. So we have a lot yet to do in the international arena, including organization, and then, if you will, mission. And I think we're just starting. We are at about 5 o'clock. I don't want to stand between you and drinks. And so thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you to the panelists, and thanks for being here.
Secretary Kramer.